There are two groups of chimpanzees living on opposite sides of a river. They cannot cross it. The river is not particularly wide by the standards of rivers that humans regularly cross without thinking about it. It is not the Amazon. It is not the Congo in its full expression. It is a river that a determined human swimmer could cross in minutes. But chimpanzees are not strong swimmers. Their anatomy, the high muscle density that makes them stronger than humans relative to body size, the lung capacity and buoyancy profile of their body composition, makes them deeply reluctant to enter water above a certain depth. They will wade through shallow streams. They will not voluntarily swim a river. The river has been there, in approximately its current configuration, for long enough that the chimpanzee populations on either side have been isolated from each other for a significant period. Not forever. They share a recent common ancestor. Their genetics are closely related, and in the geological sense, the separation is recent, but long enough for something interesting to have happened. The chimpanzees on one side of the river are significantly more aggressive than the chimpanzees on the other side. Not in the sense of individual temperament variation that you find within any population, not the difference between one grumpy individual and one mellow individual in the same group. In the systematic, population-wide, measurable sense that applies to entire communities. The average aggressiveness, the frequency of intergroup violence, the patterns of coalition aggression that characterize the more violent community, all of these are elevated on one side of the river in ways that do not reflect differences in immediate resource availability or population density. The river made them different, specifically, significantly, measurably different. And understanding exactly how one geographic barrier produced such a dramatic behavioral divergence between populations of the same species tells you something profound about the relationship between geography, genetics, social structure, resource distribution, and violence in chimpanzees and in the broader evolutionary context that connects chimpanzee behavior to the evolutionary pressures that shaped human social behavior. Start with the chimpanzee violence baseline, because before examining how a river amplified aggression in one population, it is worth establishing what chimpanzee aggression looks like in general. Chimpanzees are among the most violent of all primate species relative to their group size and ecological context. Intergroup violence, lethal raids in which members of one chimpanzee community attack and kill members of neighboring communities, is documented in chimpanzee populations across their African range. These raids are not random outbursts. They are organized, coordinated, and characterized by tactical patterns that behavioral researchers have studied extensively. Chimpanzee raids typically involve a coalition of males from one community making a targeted incursion into the territory of a neighboring community, usually when they have significant numerical advantage, and either attacking and killing individual males or females and their infants they encounter, or both. The violence is often prolonged and intense beyond what a simple dominance interaction would require. Attackers continue attacking a downed victim for extended periods, inflicting injuries far more severe than would be needed to establish dominance or end the immediate threat. This is premeditated lethal violence against members of a neighboring group. It is not defensive violence in response to immediate attack. It is organized offensive violence whose likely function, based on decades of field observation and demographic analysis, is the elimination of competitors, the expansion of territorial control, and in some cases the acquisition of females from the victim population. The similarity of this behavioral pattern to certain forms of human intergroup violence has been one of the most discussed and most controversial topics in primatology for decades. The behavioral parallel, organized male coalition, targeted lethal violence against neighboring group members, territorial expansion motivation, appears in both species and has been interpreted by some researchers as reflecting a shared evolutionary heritage of intergroup violence rooted in the common ancestor that chimpanzees and humans shared approximately 6 to 7 million years ago. Now examine the specific mechanism by which geographic isolation produces behavioral divergence. Because the river story is not simply a story about one river creating violent chimps. It is a story about how the removal of gene flow between populations allows independent evolutionary trajectories to diverge in ways that can produce dramatically different behavioral outcomes. When a geographic barrier separates a previously continuous population, it eliminates or dramatically reduces the gene flow that had been connecting those populations. Gene flow is the movement of genetic material between populations through the reproduction of individuals who move between them. When individuals from one population mate with individuals from another, they introduce their genetic variants into the receiving population. This continuous exchange acts as a homogenizing force, preventing the two populations from diverging too dramatically in any characteristic that has genetic underpinnings. Remove that homogenizing force, and the two populations can begin to diverge. Each accumulates its own mutations. Each is subject to the selection pressures of its local environment. Each experiences the random genetic drift events, the chance fluctuations in allele frequency that occur in any finite population, that reflect its particular history of births, deaths, and reproductive success. Over sufficient time, these accumulated differences produce populations that are measurably distinct in genetic composition, in physiology, and in the behavioral characteristics that have genetic underpinnings. The chimpanzees separated by the river were not originally different in their aggression levels. They were members of the same originally continuous population, presumably with similar average aggression profiles. The separation imposed by the river started two independent evolutionary trajectories, and the specific environmental and social conditions on each side of the river drove those trajectories in different directions. On the more aggressive side, the combination of resource distribution, group size, territorial pressure, and potentially the demographic composition of the founding population that happened to be present on that side when the isolation began, all contributed to a trajectory that selected for or permitted higher average aggression levels within and between groups. On the other side, different conditions produced a trajectory toward lower average aggression. Examine the ecological factors that drive variation in chimpanzee aggression across populations, because the river is a geographic mechanism, but the behavioral outcome is driven by ecological content on either side. Resource distribution is one of the most powerful determinants of chimpanzee aggression levels. Chimpanzees in environments with highly patchy, temporally variable, high-value food resources show different patterns of intergroup competition than chimpanzees in environments with more evenly distributed resources. When high-value food patches, large fruiting trees, resource-rich areas within a territory are limited and worth defending, the incentive for intergroup aggression increases because controlling those patches translates directly into caloric advantages for the controlling group. The landscape on one side of the river may have created a resource distribution pattern that elevated the value of territorial control and therefore the adaptive value of effective intergroup aggression. Communities whose territories contained more high-value resource patches, more defensible boundaries, or more limited territory size relative to population would face different incentive structures for intergroup competition than communities in more resource-abundant or more spatially extensive territories. Group size and composition also directly influence intergroup aggression patterns. Larger male coalitions can conduct more effective raids with lower individual risk. The numerical advantage that makes intergroup aggression low risk for attackers requires adequate coalition size. Communities that happen to maintain larger male coalitions, whether through demographic chance or through the social structures that produce male retention and cooperation, are both more capable of effective aggression and more likely to experience the specific success reinforcement cycle that sustains aggressive behavior across generations. Population density relative to territory size creates pressure that escalates intergroup competition. When the resource base of a territory must support more individuals, per capita resource availability declines, territorial boundaries become more valuable, and the incentive for expanding territory at the expense of neighbors increases. If one side of the river supports higher population density, whether through higher resource productivity or through demographic factors of the founding population, that side would experience greater pressure toward the territorial competition that drives intergroup aggression. Address the genetic component of behavioral divergence. Because the behavioral differences observed between isolated chimpanzee populations are not entirely explained by immediate ecological differences. there is a genetic dimension that makes the story more complex and more interesting. Behavioral traits in chimpanzees, including aggression-related traits, have measurable heritability. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. The neurological systems that regulate threat assessment, fear response, impulse control, and the appetitive motivation for aggressive behavior all have genetic components. These components do not determine behavior in the mechanistic sense that body morphology is determined, but they influence the probability and intensity of behavioral expressions and contexts. When a population is isolated and experiences different selection pressures from those operating in the original population, the genetic variance associated with specific behavioral traits can shift in frequency. Variants that increase effective territorial defense, that enhance coalition coordination during raids, or that reduce individual fear response to the risks of intergroup aggression might be positively selected in environments where intergroup competition is consistently high stakes. Variants that produce excessive aggression in contexts where it is counterproductive might be negatively selected in environments where within-group cooperation is more important than intergroup competition. Over the generations of isolation that the river separation has produced, these differential selection pressures can shift the average genetic composition of each population in the direction that the specific selection environment favors. The behavioral differences observed between the two populations are therefore not simply products of current ecological differences, but also products of the accumulated genetic divergence that has occurred over the isolation period. This combination of ecological and genetic divergence is what makes river-isolated populations so interesting as natural experiments in behavioral evolution. They provide the closest thing to a controlled comparison that nature produces. Two populations of the same species, originally similar, experiencing the same broad evolutionary forces but with one specific variable: the ecological and social conditions on each side of the isolation barrier, differing in ways that produce measurable behavioral outcomes. Now connect this to the bonobo case, because the most famous example of a river producing dramatically different behavioral outcomes in closely related great apes is not the chimpanzee case at all. It is the separation between chimpanzees and bonobos by the Congo River. Bonobos and chimpanzees diverged from a common ancestor approximately 2 million years ago. The specific mechanism of their separation is the Congo River, which became a significant barrier as it developed into its current configuration approximately 1 to 2 million years ago. The ancestors of bonobos found themselves south of the Congo River. The ancestors of chimpanzees remained to the north and spread across the rest of the chimpanzee range. The behavioral differences between the two resulting species are extraordinary and have attracted enormous scientific and popular interest. Chimpanzees are the species described above: organized lethal intergroup violence, strong male dominance hierarchies, female subordination, infanticide. Bonobos are almost the opposite. Females are co-dominant with or dominant over males. Intergroup encounters are often managed through sexual behavior rather than violence. Lethal intergroup aggression has never been reliably documented in wild bonobos, and the overall social atmosphere observed in bonobo communities is dramatically less tense than in chimpanzee communities. Two species separated by one river. One is the most violent great ape outside of humans. The other is often described as solving social tension with sex rather than violence, which is either inspiring or baffling depending on your perspective. The specific ecological explanation for this difference focuses on the resources available to bonobos south of the Congo River. The bonobos range contains, in specific locations and seasons, terrestrial herbaceous vegetation, ground-level plants that provide a high-quality food source that can be consumed in groups without significant within-group competition. The argument is that access to this resource reduced within-group feeding competition, which reduced the pressure for male coalitions to dominate females in resource contexts, which allowed a different social structure to develop in which female alliances became more powerful and within-group conflict less frequent. The specific ecological conditions that produced bonobo social structure, the specific resources that reduced within-group competition and changed the reproductive and social dynamics that determined dominance relationships, were on the south side of the Congo River. The chimpanzee range north of the river did not have the same specific resource profile, and the different ecological conditions produced the dramatically different behavioral trajectory that produced the species we observe today. One river, two behavioral outcomes, separated by approximately 2 million years of independent evolution under different ecological conditions. Examine what this river-driven behavioral divergence tells us about the evolutionary origins of human violence, because this is where the story connects most directly to the broader question of human nature. The chimpanzee and bonobo comparison has become a focal point in the scientific debate about whether human violence is part of our evolved nature or primarily a product of cultural conditions. Different researchers have emphasized different sides of this comparison to support different positions. Those who emphasize the chimpanzee-human parallel point to the behavioral similarities between chimpanzee intergroup violence and certain forms of human intergroup violence. The organized male coalition, the lethal targeting of isolated individuals from neighboring groups, the territorial expansion motivation. These similarities, they argue, reflect a shared evolutionary heritage from the common ancestor and suggest that the capacity and tendency for organized intergroup violence is a deeply evolved feature of the human behavioral repertoire. Those who emphasize the bonobo human parallel point to the bonobo's relative peacefulness, its egalitarian social tendencies, and its use of social and affiliative behavior to manage tension as evidence that the common ancestor may not have been primarily violent, and that the chimpanzee's pattern of violence is a derived condition produced by the specific ecological conditions of the chimpanzee range rather than the ancestral condition of the great ape lineage. The honest resolution of this debate is that the evidence supports neither a fully pessimistic view of human violence as inevitable evolutionary fate, nor a fully optimistic view of it as entirely culturally produced recent aberration. The behavioral plasticity demonstrated by the bonobo and chimpanzee comparison, the fact that closely related species living under different ecological conditions produce dramatically different behavioral profiles, suggests that the evolutionary heritage provides capacities rather than deterministic outcomes, and that ecological and social conditions significantly modulate which of those capacities are expressed. Humans have the capacity for both chimpanzee-like organized lethal intergroup violence and bonobo-like affiliative social management of conflict. Which of these capacities is more prominently expressed in human populations at times reflects a complex interaction of ecological conditions, social structures, cultural frameworks, and the historical circumstances that shape group behavior, the same kinds of factors that produced different behavioral profiles in chimpanzee populations separated by rivers. Address the implication of the resource distribution finding for understanding why some human groups in the ancient world were more violent than others, because the ecological mechanisms that drive behavioral divergence in chimpanzees apply in modified forms to ancient human populations. Ancient human communities living under conditions of high intergroup resource competition. In environments where territorial control translated directly into caloric security, where population density exceeded what a territory could comfortably support, where the resource distribution created defensible patches worth fighting over, would have experienced selection pressures for intergroup aggression capability that communities in resource-abundant, low-density environments would not. The archaeological evidence for variation in ancient human intergroup violence across different environments and time periods is consistent with this ecological framework. Violence evidence, skeletal trauma patterns consistent with interpersonal violence, mass grave sites with evidence of violent death, weapons with uses against other humans rather than prey animals, is not uniformly distributed across ancient sites. It clusters in contexts that tend to be associated with resource pressure, population density, and a geographic circumscription that limited the option of simply moving away from competitors. The ancient human groups who were most violent were not necessarily the most aggressive by inherited temperament. They were the groups whose ecological situations made territorial competition most consequential and whose specific structures most effectively organized collective violence. The river story applied to ancient humans is not about the genetics of aggression. It is about the ecological and social conditions that determine when the capacity for organized violence is activated and expressed at the population level. Here is the philosophical dimension that the river story ultimately reveals. The river did not make the chimpanzees violent. The river isolated two populations and allowed the ecological conditions on each side to drive independent behavioral trajectories. The conditions on the more aggressive side, whatever specific combination of resource distribution, population pressure, territorial boundaries, and social structure they involved, selected for a behavioral profile that expressed higher average aggression than the conditions on the other side produced. If the ecological conditions had been reversed, if the resource-rich, less competitive conditions had been on the aggressive side and the more pressured conditions on the passive side, the behavioral difference would probably have been reversed as well. This is the message of the river story. Behavior is not fixed by genetics alone. It is the product of the interaction between genetic potential and ecological conditions, social structure, demographic history, and the cultural transmission processes that perpetuate behavioral norms across generations. The same species, separated by one river, can produce dramatically different behavioral profiles when the conditions on each side are sufficiently different for sufficient time. The chimpanzees on the violent side of the river are not evil. The chimpanzees on the peaceful side are not morally superior. They are the same species expressing different aspects of the shared behavioral potential of their species, shaped by the specific conditions that the geographic accident of the river produced. Here is the full picture. Two groups of chimpanzees, one river, sufficient time, different ecological conditions on each side. The result is behavioral divergence that is measurable, significant, and illuminating about the fundamental nature of how environmental conditions shape the expression of behavioral potential in social animals. The river did not put aggression into one group. The river created the conditions for different selection pressures to operate on the same underlying behavioral potential, producing different average behavioral outcomes from the same starting point. The violence is ecological as much as it is genetic. The peacefulness on the other side is ecological as much as it is genetic. Neither side's behavioral profile is the inevitable destiny of the species. Both are the product of historical conditions that a geographic accident produced. Understanding this does not make the violence less real or less serious. The chimpanzees killed by intergroup raids are just as dead regardless of whether the ecological explanation for the violence is compelling. But it does change the interpretive framework in ways that matter enormously for understanding both chimpanzee behavior and the broader evolutionary context that connects chimpanzee behavior to our own. Violence in great apes, including humans, is not a fixed genetic fate. It is a capacity whose expression is modulated by conditions. The conditions can change, the expression changes with them. One river demonstrated this. The chimpanzees on both sides of it have been demonstrating it ever since.